Rick Steves has been called America's most respected authority on European travel, and after tonight, you'll understand why the European sort of doesn't even hold anymore. You'll come to realize that really, frankly, his sphere of knowledge extends to the whole bloody world. Rick took his first trip to Europe in 1969, visiting piano factories with his father, who was a piano importer. As an 18-year-old, he began traveling on his own, funding his trips by teaching piano. In 1976, he started his business, Rick Steves Europe, which has grown from a one-man operation to, well, something considerably larger than that. 100 full-time, well-traveled employees at his headquarters in Edmonds, Washington. He's written more than 80 travel guidebooks and phrase books and hosts a weekly public radio program, Travel with Rick Steves, as well as the popular public television series, Rick Steves Europe. Rick has created 3 award-winning specials for public television, including Iran, Yesterday, and Today, and written books beyond his guidebooks, including Travel as a Political Act. When not on the road, Rick is active in his church and with advocacy groups focused on economic and social justice, drug policy reform, and ending hunger. And frankly, the list of Rick's philanthropic interests and commitments is broader than that. There's hardly a corner of the life of this community that he hasn't touched with his generosity. And frankly, finally, I've lost count. I think this is the 6th, maybe it's the 7th, perhaps it's the 20th appearance by Rick on this very stage. But it's his first appearance under this new acoustic reflector and in our newly revitalized building. So without anything further, please join me in offering a warm, it's such a pleasure to be able to say, please welcome Rick Steves.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. About 6 months ago, Weir and I were just excited about the opening festivities of this great facility here, and he asked me if I'd come in and give a talk, and I said, well, I should do something new, I suppose. And he said, what do you have new? And I said, I'll just be coming back from Ethiopia and Guatemala, producing a 1-hour special on why is there hunger and why should we work to end it. And we thought that's a great idea. And I'm just really excited to be here as part of this opening festivities to share what I learned in Guatemala and Ethiopia. And we've been working really hard because we have this wonderful gig with public television, and we can take issues that we think are important and share them with our country. And public television has a mission that I'm very enthusiastic about, and it's similar to the mission of Town Hall. It just provides a place for people to come together and share ideas and inspire and challenge and educate each other so we can be better citizens and make this world a better place. So I'm really, I have no idea what I'm going to say in the next hour, so because I've never given this talk before, and I've got some slides that I've put together, and I just want to give you a candid sort of fun behind-the-scenes look at what we did, how we did it, and what we learned. So I'm going to talk for about 75 minutes, I think, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. As Shane said, there's 2 mics here, so we can just answer a few questions that way. Afterwards, I'd be happy to just hang out down here and sign things if you like, or get a photograph or whatever. What I do for a gig like this, if we're going to have autographs, is just don't stand in a polite line. Just gather around me 360 degrees, hold out whatever you want autographed, and I just go like this. Seriously, until it's all gone, and it goes very fast, and it's just kind of fun. So we'll have a little mosh pit right there. I'll apologize for my voice. I've lost my voice, and I just have no idea where it is. But I can talk like this, and I'm just not quite as able to project as I would like to be. Okay, so we went out there to produce this show. It's going to air all over the United States, God willing, on public television in January. 1-hour special called Hunger and Hope, Lessons Learned from Ethiopia and Guatemala. And, you know, I've been interested in this ever since I was a kid. When you travel, you know, when I was a student, I went to India and traveled around Africa and Central America and so on. And if you got your window down and your eyes and your heart open, you're aware that we're privileged and there's a lot of desperation on this planet. It didn't ever occur to me as a guilt trip. It still doesn't. It's just a reality that I don't want to be blind to. I want to be mindful of it, and I want to live my life in a way where I can help bring the developing world and the rich world together. So that's been in my mind for ages. When I traveled after that, it occurred to me, I did these educational tours many times through organizations that take you down there, not to see the famous sites, but to talk to people and to deal with complicated issues. And it occurred to me, there's more than enough food in every country to feed all of its people. It's a matter of distribution. It's a matter of economics. It's structural poverty. People are hungry because there's a structural system that keeps some people unable to get what they need and other people have more than what they need. You know, that's kind of the way the world is, and it can be moderated, I thought. And one thing I learned in my travels is, this shot is 40 years old, and it's stuck with me ever since. These girls are just as precious as my kids and your kids. There's no doubt about it. In my mind, we're all children of God, we're all equally precious, and there's no proximity about need or suffering. Suffering across the ocean is just as real as suffering across the street. Some of us can see across the street, and some of us can see across the ocean. But if you've been fortunate enough to travel, I think the world is your playground. The world is your classroom. Thomas Jefferson wrote that travel makes a person wiser, if less happy. I've always thought about that. He's a smart guy. He knew a lot of stuff, and travel complicates your life. You're exposed to things that you either are going to say, no, ignorance is bliss, I don't want to know about that, or you will engage with it. And I want to engage with it. I know the gap between us and south of the border. I know that we're 4% of this planet. That's a good reminder to take a moment and turn off all of your noisemakers. We're 4% of this planet, and there's 96% out there. And we can get to know the neighbors, and then we can empathize with the neighbors. Something else that occurred to me in my travels, long time ago, even if you're motivated only by greed, if all you care about is your own security and how rich your kids are, you don't want to be filthy rich in a desperately poor world. It's not a nice place. Even if you can barricade yourself behind designer fortifications, as the elites are in these countries, it's not a successful situation. And we're all better off if we have a healthy mix of wealthy and struggling people, but a middle class and hope and reason for people to play by the rules and so on. This is a very poignant sight. When I was in Guatemala, you get the little neighborhood newspaper and they're selling razor wire. You don't see razor wire sold in our neighborhoods that much, but it's part of living in the developing world, because there's such a chasm between wealthy and poor people. You can think about that in terms of two families and neighborhoods, or you can think about it in terms of countries and other countries. Walls to keep out the poor people, to protect the rich people, to let you not know what's out there, you know. It's just not a winning situation. If your solution is walls, you're missing the opportunity. So, I, just in the last year, was having dinner with people who run the United Nations World Food Program in Rome. I was brainstorming with people in the Gates Foundation. I was getting to know different NGOs that are really making a difference, and they all had certain things in common. And one of them was, we're doing great to tackle poverty and hunger on this planet. People that don't know anything about this say, oh, we're just wasting money and there's more hungry people than ever, you know. But no, in the last generation, extreme poverty has been cut in half, from 2 billion to less than 1 billion. Today, it's a beautiful, beautiful trajectory. Today, there's 700 million people in extreme poverty, living on $2 a day. Now, half of our planet is trying to live on $5 a day. That's poor. But that's okay. I think there's going to be poor. What I think is realistic, pragmatic, whether you care about, whether you got a heart for poor people or whether you're just interested in your own security, is to deal with extreme poverty. That's 700 million people trying to live on $2 a day. Give them reason for hope. Give them reason to play ball and get on board. Give them an opportunity to raise their kids, to be productive. That's the goal. That's the goal of the United Nations. That's the goal of Gates in a lot of ways. That's the goal of all of these great, wonderful NGOs. and we can do it. It's very important to realize we can do it. Now, a lot of people, since I've been talking about this, are predisposed to have excuses to think that development aid is a waste of money. What about this? What about the corruption? What about that? You know, there's a lot of old development aid, old-fashioned development aid that was wrong-minded. It was well-meaning, but it was well-minded, and it made people dependent. But modern development aid is something that a lot of people don't recognize. It is smart, it's pragmatic, it's something anybody can embrace if they just want to be practical and productive. I like this photograph because this is a little tiny village off the grid in Ethiopia, and this is a coffee shop or a tea house or something, and they advertise by putting a tea kettle, and it's standing on top of an old USAID canister. And the USAID, where we just give them food, is no longer how you do development aid anymore, because that just bails out farmers here, it enriches shipping companies, and it floods the recipient country with food that demoralizes their farmers so they don't even bother to plant, because there's all this free food at the port. It's just completely wrong. And if you discount the value and the practical worth of development aid because of that kind of wrong-minded, old-fashioned charity, then you're talking 20th century. This is the 21st century, and there's smart development aid, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk first just about how we filmed our show, and then I'm going to talk what I learned and what I think is smart, pragmatic, anybody who cares about stability, anybody who cares about fighting hunger, anybody who cares about responsible use of your philanthropic money or your government's foreign aid can embrace and be excited about. The best way to learn is to go travel. We know that. You learn so much when you have the opportunity to just walk with the people and talk directly to them. I chose Guatemala and Ethiopia for the classrooms. And I wanted a place in Latin America, and I wanted a place in sub-Saharan Africa. And both of these are, I think, telegenic countries. They're great classrooms for a program like this. My program is not to show you how to travel or why to travel in Guatemala and Ethiopia. When you go to Guatemala, did you see the great Mayan ruins? Did you go to the volcanoes and the lakes? No, I didn't even know where I was. I was going to little villages way off the grid to learn about structural poverty and what's being done about it, you see. I liked Guatemala because it's a connection just south of our border. It's where our school buses go when we no longer want them. You see, Guatemala is a country of 16 million people. The per capita income is $8,000, which is quite a lot. That's a lot of money in the developing world. But the problem in Guatemala is there's a horrible gap between rich and poor. And it's the indigenous people in Guatemala that are suffering. Most of their kids are stunted, and that's where the hunger is, the extreme poverty. So there's a lot of money in Guatemala, but there's a corrupt government and a greedy elite, and there's no middle class hardly, and you've got that big pool of people who are struggling. I like Guatemala because it's a very indigenous country. Along with Bolivia, it's the most indigenous country in our hemisphere, and I find that's just a vibrant culture, and it's something that we can focus in on. And Guatemala has an amazing sense of fashion. You go to villages, it's just kind of funny, up in the highlands, all the guys in the town wear the same exact pants. What did we see? Well, I didn't see anything famous. I just saw struggling little workaday towns and villages, and that was really what I wanted to see on this trip, and I wanted to talk to people. So Guatemala was one destination, and what a strange flight, Guatemala City to Addis Ababa. So with our crew, we did that, and then when we get to Ethiopia, you've got another great classroom for studying the structural basis of poverty and what's being done in a constructive way to fight it. Guatemala is 100 million people. The per capita income is $800, 1/10 of Guatemala. But while Guatemala is a case of corruption and a case of lost opportunities and a frustrating world we'll talk about gangs and stuff in a minute, Ethiopia is a model for development. They've got a new prime minister that people are excited about. They've got their first woman president. They've got, it's the only country in Africa that was never a European colony. It's the headquarters of the African Union, and it is a country with 100 million people who really, really want to work. The government knows the importance of education, there's huge need, and it's a land of opportunity. It has many years in a row of impressive development. It's incremental. We have to take it step at a time, but Ethiopia is a great opportunity to see what is the need and what's being done. Of course, there's big cities. Addis Ababa is an amazing city, and in Addis Ababa we've got the headquarters of the African Union, and you feel that there's a top-down interest in fighting this, as well as people in the grassroots way that are ready to roll up their sleeves and work. So I went over and did the scouting a year ago, and this was just a great opportunity to see the teamwork that's happening. You've got caring American NGOs in here, we've got government officials, we've got, in the case of Ethiopia, people from the Gates Foundation, we've got me coming in as kind of a journalist, and it's teamwork. The government has to work with the NGOs, have to work with the local people, have to work with the business community. This woman, Maran, was our sort of fixer from the Gates Foundation. Very thankful to have Gates' support in my touring of Ethiopia. If you want to get anything done in Ethiopia in this sort of area, the Gates Foundation is where it's at. Gates has a particular interest in Ethiopia, and they work well with the government. The government recognizes the value of this partnership. Gates does not really do the developmental work themselves. Gates looks at the whole big picture and helps empower different organizations to do that work effectively and efficiently. And they laid out, they didn't show me their stuff. I told them what I wanted to see, and they helped me go through all the red tape and provided me with the transportation, and we made a tour out of it. It was really helpful. I went there scouting, and then 6 months later I came back with the crew, and we met with those same people. I also got support from the United Nations World Food Program. And when I'm working with these organizations, I'm just so impressed by the caliber of the people who are dedicating their lives to these challenges. You know, the people like Laura Mello here, who is the Guatemala director of the World Food Program, she's in charge of the United Nations program there in Guatemala. She could have any job she wants in the fancy world. And she's just really in the thick of it, in the trenches, making a huge difference. And I always feel like if there's people down there dedicating their lives to that, we who are up here can support them by knowing what they're doing and making sure they've got the wherewithal to do what they need to do. So I would go on that scouting trip and meet with different people. One challenge when we're making a TV show about this is to make sure it's not just me coming down and saying, what are the solutions? That wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to give voice to people there in the trenches, and I got to meet a lot of people. This is a community leader in a barrio that's literally on the garbage dump in Guatemala that we got to know. I met with him in the shanty town, and we come back later with our crew, and it was a powerful part of the show. So 6 months later, my producer, Simon, he's with me on all my shows. We get the crew together, and we head down there. Normally, it's just three of us, the producer, the cameraman, this is Carl Bauer next to me, and myself. And this time we took Sean, another cameraman, because we really wanted to get all the B-roll, and we had to do a lot of interviews, and it was just cumbersome kind of filming, and we wanted to have an expanded crew. It was tough when you want to be a backdoor traveler and get to know people and eat the local food and all that kind of stuff. I had to make compromises in that because we just had to take care of our gear, stay healthy, and get the script covered. So it's a little bit, it's kind of serious travel. If you're an American film crew, you've got to have an escort, you've got to stay in business class hotels, you got to eat carefully so you stay healthy. So, and the infrastructure is not that efficient like you'd be used to in the United States or Europe. This is the waiting room at an airport right here. And, we're just trying to make sure all of our gear gets to the next place. And it was just disappointing, frankly, from a travel point of view. The script writing was really a trick because we had this challenge of not being patronizing. That's a problem when rich white people come down from the developed world and say what all the solutions are. We have 6,000 words for a 1-hour show. How are we going to give voice to all of the people who really know what the world is like from their perspective and what they need and what works and what doesn't? One thing I learned was the importance of road bias. Road bias is a very interesting thing. If you drove from here to Portland on I-5, you would have road bias because you would just see what everybody else is seeing. You know, if you got off the road and did the little roads all the way down, you'd have a much more real experience. It's the same in Europe when you travel, and it's certainly the same in Guatemala or Ethiopia. The very best filming that we got was an hour off the road down a path like that, basically. And there we realized most of the world is an hour's drive away from electricity and water infrastructure and paved roads. It was quite striking to me. And the humanity of that was really powerful. The reality from a first world film crew point of view is there's no place to eat at a town like that. So we'd have these miserable boxed lunches from the hotel breakfast. That was our lunch almost every day, but that was kind of just the routine when you get off of the grid. We partnered with a lot of NGOs, non-government organizations from the developed world, Europeans or Americans, but we favored those organizations that empower local people to do the work. Because a new sensibility about development work is you need to have local ownership, you have to have local people down where the rubber hits the road. And this was Laura from the World Food Program, but this was one of her lieutenants in one district where they're doing their work. So I got to interview the people who were running the NGOs, but what we really wanted to do was see the actual local people, working with local people, making that difference. Of all the shooting we did, the only time I felt like in danger was when we went into the barrio at the garbage dump in Guatemala City, which is a center for gang activity and that sort of thing. But I really wanted to cover the gang problem in Central America, because that's part of why there is extreme poverty there now. And we had to keep the camera under wraps until we got into our friend's house, a corrugated tin house in the middle of this shanty town. Then we could take it out and try to get a sense of what it was really like to live there, and what work was he doing in that place that was so plagued by all of that gang action. Again, there was an awkward kind of thing with the wealthy, well-meaning white guy from the first world coming in, and there's a lot of just caring, wealthy people from the developed world whose passion and heart is for helping out. And it's beautiful stuff. And what I wanted to do in the show was not show charity. There's a lot of great charity work, and there's a lot of people that run orphanages that just are doing beautiful, beautiful stuff. But what I wanted to show was what was development aid. For me, that was my goal. Is development aid worthwhile? And we did that by talking with local people who are empowering other local people to make their lives better. And that, to me, was the real rewarding experience. I wanted also to be embraced by people who don't really care about love your neighbor. You know, there's two ways you could be into this issue. You could be in it because you care about your neighbor. It's the right thing to do. We have all of this wealth and they're desperate. We could help them out. But there's a lot of people in the privacy of the voting booth that really don't care about that. And what they care about is their own security and their own financial well-being. And I wanted to look at this in a way that both kinds of people could say, yes, this makes sense. And that means to look at it from a capitalism point of view, to look at it from a globalization point of view, look at it from a point of view where human people are considered human capital. It's a harsh term to think of people as human capital, but I wanted to do that. And you can do it. You can frame it in both ways. Of course, I would imagine probably most people in this room would think it's just right because there's desperation down there and it's the right thing to do and we can help out. But even if you don't think that way, that's what's exciting for me. There's a rationale for getting involved. So we went to business leaders, and some people say, oh, no, you don't want to just have a bunch of sweatshops. You want people to still have their idyllic existence in the villages and so on. But no, globalization is real. People need to engage in globalization. In Central America, they say globalization's like a big train. Get on it or get run over. So we embraced globalization as a positive thing, and then we looked at it through a lens of how can these developing societies be part of the global economy. As a public television film crew, we didn't have a lot of gear with us. So, this is just an example of how my producer works. There's Simon powering the dolly, which is just some kind of a crate, as our cameraman stands there and glides by all these people working in a big industrial shed in Ethiopia. So doing the on-cameras was really fun for me because I had to remember my lines and I had to try to ignore all of the commotion around me. Because you can imagine we had a film crew in a town that's never seen an American film crew, you'd have a lot of attention. And this was what was just to my right. So it was a good exercise for me to work on my concentration. And everywhere we went, we just met beautiful people, wonderful people. It is really interesting for me to think that, that tripod cost more than the total net worth of everybody in that group's family, And we had 3 of them in the car just in case we needed an extra one. The distance between us in the way of our power and our freedom and our opportunities and our wealth was just mind-blowing. But I didn't feel any negative. I didn't feel any anger. I just felt it was great to get to know people and humanize. Everywhere we went, we had kids helping us out, carrying our gear for us. We had a big crew. Okay, so that was kind of how we did the shoot. Now, it took us 20 days there to make the show. It's being produced right now, and it's going along really well. It should air all over the country in January. The issues I wanted to talk about, one is the gap between rich and poor. And I like this slide because there's a gap between rich and poor even when they're dead. This is the big cemetery in Guatemala, and you can see a cemetery for an elite, a tomb for an elite, and then a tomb for a bunch of people who aren't elite. And it's just very striking to me to think of these gated communities. There's a place in Guatemala City called Ciudad Calleja, which means the paradise city in the indigenous language. And it's like Bell Square with gates around it, and it's just first world comfortable, first world safe, all the first world shops, everything you want in this impossible little fortified zone. And then in the same town, just a couple miles away, there's a big dump, an open dump where thousands of people are earning their living as professional recyclers, scavenging. And we stood there and we watched this activity. And we talked to Fido, our friend in the barrio, whose family lives in a little barrio built literally on the dump. If you dug into his floor, it'd be layers of garbage. And he told us what it was like because he worked for years in the dump. And he said, your hands are scarred. So many infections. Every time you reach for something, you get bloodied. He said, people compete for the opportunity to scavenge in the dump. It's a prized position to be able to jump on that truck and hitchhike a ride into the dump and then work all day gathering whatever you can gather, putting it in a big bag and selling it. If you made $4 in the day, you'd be doing pretty well. He said, when you work in the dump, you smell like trash. Your clothes smell like trash. You can take a shower, you can wash your clothes, you still smell like trash. When your son goes to school, he smells like trash, and people treat him like trash. And this is a whole class of people. And I thought, that's urban extreme poverty. There's a big allure pulling people from the countryside into the big cities with the promise of jobs. And it happens in our society, it happens in France, it happens all over the developing world. And big cities are really a collection of broken dreams in so many ways. And countless people depopulate the countryside, they leave the farms, and they end up setting up a shack in a shanty town in a ravine, which the government said is not fit for humans to live on. But you got to live there because you can't spend half your daily wage taking the bus from safe real estate and affordable real estate to your job. You got to live by your job in the ravine. That's kind of the reality of people struggling in the big city. And then when you go there as a first world journalist or tourist or whatever, you really need to have a safe place to stay. So you stay in the Sheraton, like we did. It's dangerous at the Sheraton. You can't take pictures of it because they don't, for security, they don't want anybody taking pictures when you're out in the yard and stuff. So I took just a picture of the model of it. But it's, it cost $300 a night. And it occurred to me that's 150 days' wages for the people we were photographing. It's amazing when you think 150 days' wages for one night. And we had single rooms instead of double rooms because we didn't want to hear each other snore. I mean, it's amazing what we can buy. Ivanka Trump happened to be there when we were there. And the difference between our world and that reality is something we need to understand. We just need to recognize that when you go home after a day of sightseeing in Addis Ababa and you order a beer, it costs $10, 2 or 3 days' wages for the people out on the streets. So I didn't want to focus on this in the TV show, but I did want to make it clear what is extreme poverty. What is the reality of somebody trying to live on $2 a day? 1/10 of humanity is in extreme poverty. And again, this is what in my program, and this is what Gates and World Food Program and so on are interested in tackling. It's not pie in the sky, utopian, let's overcome poverty. It's let's be realistic. There is extreme poverty, and that can be dealt with very reasonably. And a person who is in extreme poverty lives in Africa in a grass hut like this. It looks kind of, idyllic, but when you step inside, you realize these people are living off the grid, no electricity. When the sun goes down, their world is dark. No water. The women and the children spend hours every day walking for water. Dirt floor. Open fire. No chimney. Open fire on the ground, no chimney. It's filled with smoke. Respiratory diseases are a major problem for women and children who live in this kind of squalor. If they own an animal, they share the same space with the animal. Dirt floor, grass hut, grass roof. Okay, never any money to see a doctor. One accident, one storm, one bit of violent conflict in the neighborhood or whatever, and these kids go hungry. No hope. No opportunity to develop. Women spend hours carrying firewood and fetching water. And then this is moving into the kind of simple lifestyle, reasonable kind of poverty that I think is successful because the development is incremental. I saw this all over Ethiopia. Grandma and Grandpa's old dirt floor, round, thatched hut, and then the new generation's square building with a metal roof, a concrete floor, access to electricity, ventilation, a chimney with a stove. That's not too much to ask for. That's the $5 a day level. So we wanted to focus really on the $5 a day level as the goal to take the $2 a day level people to. And we humanized it by making friends with families in Ethiopia and in Guatemala. This was Diego and Katerina, and we got to see what their world was like. Now, one thing fundamental for Diego and Katerina is they own their land. They own their land. Land issues are huge. There's a lot of fundamental issues that are like key ingredients, and we'll talk about them in the next half hour or so. But they own their land. They've got a house with a metal roof with concrete floor. They've got electricity, and they've got one faucet with a sink that they have for their water. That's a beautiful thing. Their kids can be nourished, their kids can be healthy, their kids can go to school. This stove is an example of the low-hanging fruit that I get all excited about when it comes to this kind of development. The average poorest people are farmers, little family farmers. And the average farmer has, as I said, an open fire on the floor. And an open fire, if you've got a cabin up in the mountains like I do, an old-fashioned stove consumes about triple the firewood of a new modern stove, right? I've got that in my cabin. My parents have a modern stove, I've got an old one, and it's just like two different machines. Well, it's the same thing for all these millions of people whose lives are heated and powered by firewood. If they have a stove, they consume 70% less firewood. That means 70% less walking, that means 70% less deforestation. And if they have a chimney, a simple chimney, they have fresh air and a healthy environment for their kids and their family to live in. So these are very, very simple solutions. And is it appropriate for people from the developed world to come down and say, you know, you could have a chimney and you wouldn't have respiratory problems? Some people think that's cultural imperialism or something like that. I think that's just helping out. And you don't need to force this on people. You say, who wants a chimney? And then one guy says, I'll try something radical. He's got a chimney, and the other people say, who needs a chimney? We've always did this. My grandparents did this. You know? And all of a sudden, this guy's got a healthy family, and other people go, you know, I'll have one of those chimneys. So that's what aid workers are finding, is that you've got a lot of traditional inertia, and you've got to just get one little groundbreaker, one little experimental guy to try it in the village, and then other people see, oh, he's got healthier kids. Oh, he's got making more money off of his crops. Or his soil doesn't get washed away with the torrential downpour. And then it kind of spreads that way. But a stove that's elevated and smart with a chimney is a huge breakthrough. And that's just one concrete example of many, many huge breakthroughs that are low-tech and cheap and easy for people to learn about as they develop. You got to get away from the open fire on the floor. This is Abedi. He was our example of this success story in a very modest way in a village in Ethiopia. And his father had that same land, and he was a subsistence farmer. All he did was grow corn, and it was what they subsisted on, and that's all they could do. With modern agriculture techniques, diversification, Abedi now gets double the yield, so he doesn't use all of his land for corn. He's got enough food for his family, and then he's diversified, and he's got other crops that can be sold in the market, and then he's got a little business going on. This is the sort of the modern farmer. They're still small holding family farms, but now they're part of the market rather than subsistence. They're business people. Ideally, they have firm title to their land, and they have coaching, which we'll talk about in a minute, from the government and from NGOs, so they take care of their soil and they can deal with the consequences of climate change, and they are now doing much better than they were in the past. Fundamental to development is water. Fundamental to giving a talk is water, I guess, too. And I think the defining water situation between the extremely poor and just the poor would be, are you going to a river for your water, or do you have a well or a faucet for your water? The poorest people go to the river, and then they're reliant on rain. And if there's a drought, they don't have water, and they got big trouble. Plus, the water is not healthy, and there's many reasons that's not good. Better off people have water infrastructure. When we travel, you can't believe how dominant it is just fetching water. We take for granted that when we want water, we just go like that and we have water. It's filtered. We get upset if it takes too long for our water to heat up in the shower. Come on, you know. It's amazing the difference. I mean, with our tours, I know what happens in a hotel when the water's not working. You got unhappy travelers, you know. So we get spoiled that way. In most of the world, the average lot in life is to walk for water. The men don't do it, the women do it, and the children do it. It's expensive. It takes the kids away from school. It takes the wife away from the farming. It's just, and every year they have to walk farther. When you go off the grid in Ethiopia, all you see are these yellow jerry cans and people walking for water. A well. A well cost $4,000. It's beyond the reach of a lot of villages, but it's a pretty cool investment. $4,000 to give a village water. It saves all those moms all those hours every morning. It lets those kids go to school. It lets people raise their kids healthy and properly nourished. It opens the door to so much development. And it causes me to think about the beautiful connection that we can have with the developing world. Can we afford $4,000 for a well for a village that nobody has water? That's a lot of money. My daughter had $4,000 for braces because her parents wanted her to have straight teeth. And there was money left over for whitener. I noticed every kid in my daughter's class had the wherewithal to scrape together $4,000 to get braces. Now, our kids get braces. We have a system that works. We love our kids. We work hard. They get braces. We like to have our kids have straight teeth. It's not a guilt trip. But as an honest person about the reality on this planet, I like to be aware that for the cost of my daughter's braces, you could give an entire thirsty village water. Thomas Jefferson says, travel makes a person wiser if less happy. Now I've got a quandary. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to advocate for soft power in our community. What do we do? What's our priorities in our budget? Last year we spent $700 billion with a B on military. Why? To be safe. Okay, let's agree. We need a military to be safe. I agree with that. But let's say the bottom line is not funding industries to stoke our economy by buying military gear, but the bottom line is to be safe. And I want to spend that money, that taxpayer money, in a way that makes me the safest. There's hard power, and that's a slam dunk because a lot of people with lots of lobbyists make a lot of money with hard power expenses. And there's soft power. Okay, you can't completely demilitarize, but you could take a little bit of your hard power money and put it into soft power, not because you care about that kid, but because you want to be safer and you want to have a more stable world. That's reasonable. So you think incremental value of more investment in the military compared to investing a little bit in soft power. Here's a good example. We need to have soldiers in Afghanistan. For every extra soldier you have in Afghanistan, it costs well over $1 million a year. It costs over $2 million, but I like to keep it very conservative. Let's say it costs $1 million to have one extra soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year. Every year, one extra soldier, $1 million. A well cost $4,000. You have one less soldier in Afghanistan, and you're a little bit less safe. And you take that money and you buy 250, is that what it is? 250 wells. And you put them smartly in 250 thirsty villages in sub-Saharan Africa. And you do it in a way where the local people own it. They have to pay $1 a month to upkeep it, to make a fund to upkeep it. They have a committee that makes sure it's being taken care of. This is new development. You don't just throw it at them. They earn it, they own it, they take care of it, they are good stewards of it. But the rich world prioritizes to give them a little boost. Okay, now you've got one less soldier in Afghanistan, you got 250 villages where the moms, all the moms in that village, every morning, instead of walking across the county, they walk across the street and they pump water for their family. What do they think when they pump that water? God bless America. God bless America. You don't care about that person, you just want to be safe, okay? So you got all the moms in all these villages helping their kids be healthy, helping their kids go to school, and saying God bless America every morning when they fill their jerry can. Is that a good investment from a security point of view? Of course it is. Will we ever do it? No. Why not? I don't know. Well, I do know, but that would be much more edgy and political. So that is security right there. That's development aid. That's something we can afford, and it makes a difference. And you see that. And then later the development goes where they have a pipe that goes to the house. And this well-off family actually has one sink where they can wash their clothes right there and brush their teeth. You gotta love it. I love it. When I see it, I almost cry. It's so human. It's so tangible, it is so possible. If you're moved by this talk tonight, there's organizations that dig wells. First Sunday of every month in my church, we all put money in a bucket and our church builds wells. There's ways to make a difference. Or there's ways to complain about charity and they're just going to have more kids if you feed them, you know? So, smart farming is so exciting. And as I mentioned earlier, there's enough food in every country to feed its people, and this can be sustained, and this can be distributed, and this can be built upon. There's so much smart agriculture happening now, and it makes a huge difference. Abadi, he's no longer a subsistence farmer. In Ethiopia, it's a great example, I think, of working to develop their agriculture. Ethiopia is 100 million people. They've divided the country into 18,000 little tiny districts. Each little district is coordinated in a hierarchy from the government, top down, and they have dictates. You know, what's the best way to have climate-resistant, drought-resistant seeds? What's the best way to fertilize your land? How should you rotate the crops? What should you put in there, alfalfa between the corn so the soil gets more replenished? How can you work on your water management? The United States gives us food. We're just not going to give you food. You're going to earn it by terracing and digging reservoirs so when the rain comes down in a torrent, it doesn't wash the topsoil away, but it replenishes our water table. And then we have water infrastructure, and we have a solar panel that pumps it into a reservoir so that we can now have droughts but have no famines. See, this is smart development today. Because of climate change, there's more droughts than ever, but because of smart agriculture, smart tech, smart development, there's no more famines. They think in the future famines will be a thing of the past. Ethiopia has had several famine-worthy droughts and no famines lately because they can anticipate them, they can control the water, they've got their reservoirs. This is just dealing with climate change and progress. To me, it is so exciting. Here we have those 18 little cabales, I think they're called, and there's a team of 60,000 people employed by the government, about 3 people per cabale, that come and coach the farmers smart agriculture techniques. Traditionally, they would scatter their seeds. It's what Grandpa did. It worked. Now, they teach them you got to do your seeds in a straight line and you get double the yield. You know, that takes a little encouraging, but it's just flat out smarter, and farmers are getting the news. So there's plenty of ways that you can organize a society, and you've got NGOs, you've got government that's smart, you've got hardworking locals. It all comes together, and Ethiopia is developing, and it's encouraging. This is in Guatemala. This is Pedro, and Pedro was working in, every year he left his family to cut, with a machete, to cut the sugar cane, and he was working for plantation wages. You can imagine what that's like. And he decided he wants to have his own place, so he got some land, he got a loan, he got a lawyer to help him really have firm title to that land, and now he owns his land free and clear. There's another organization right there, Agros, is in the lobby. It's a Seattle-based organization that mission is to help farmers get firm title to their land with a loan and a lawyer and a plan to pay off that land and then get out of the way. That's what Agros does. I love it. It's smart development aid by an NGO here in the developed world to make our world more stable and more just. And for Pedro now, this is one of the local coaches on the Agros team. He's got his land. He's growing he's a diversified crop. He's growing what will sell. And he says when he walks through his fields, it's like walking through money. That's what he told us. Can you imagine opening a hardworking man like this up to a chance to own his own land, to produce food that he's not going to consume, but that he's going to sell in the market, and he's becoming a little capitalist? It's a beautiful thing, and it can happen. It's smart agriculture. This man's got a seed. Seeds are so important. Better yield, drought-resistant, products that will sell on the market instead of for local consumption. And there's a lot of smartness going on that way. There's something called climate smart agriculture that lets, there's a different environment now for farmers, and they need a different kind of seed. They need a different kind of chicken. They need a different kind of cow. These chickens here lay triple the eggs of the local chickens, and that's a huge improvement for farmers. That's an initiative with the NGO. This is a cow that is a Holstein crossed with a local African species, so it gives much more milk, but it can handle the heat and the environment of Africa. And that's a tricky job to provide the right kind of crossbreed of a cow. But boy, when they get it right, it's really good for the local farmers, and the local farmers know it. Now, if you're a local farmer in Guatemala, a cow doesn't do you a lot of good because of the makeup of the indigenous people. The children cannot digest cow's milk, but they can digest goat's milk. This is something that modern NGOs have helped teach them. And now NGOs help them with a goat facility where the villagers can bring their goat in. It's got a little thing called the Love Shack, and the goat goes home pregnant. And now the family has 3 goats instead of 1 goat. And they've got plenty of milk that the kids can actually digest. So these, again, are the low-hanging fruits, the little promising examples. I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I've been able to walk down there and see it and to just become a believer in the value of helping out. This is Diego and Katerina with their goat shack at home, and they're so proud of it. And they've got nice clothes, they can send their kids to school, they can pay for a doctor, they own their land, and they're not just subsistence farmer growing one thing for the family to try to live on. They do that with a little patch of the land, and then they've got diversity, and they've even got animal husbandry, and animal husbandry is a big deal in coping with climate change down the road. Something that all NGOs and development agencies these days seem to get, in really where it's so clear, is women are the key to development. Men just piss it away. And if you're going to get anything done, you got to empower women. They care about the family. They don't spend it on alcohol and in a brothel or something like that. It's just responsible. So, but there's a lot of cultural inertia that keeps women unable to have that responsibility. So we need modern governments, we need NGOs, we need education. And that's part of this new flavor of development. With educated, empowered women, you can have hygiene and you can have better nutrition. And all over, thank you, I guess, all over, you've got this recognition. In Addis Ababa, there's an organization called WISE, Women in Self-Employment, and they're taking women from the barrio, from the villages, they're educating them, and they're giving them vocational training, and they're empowering them. Here's an organization that really gets the support of the government, that the Gates Foundation is impressed by and works with, and that takes these women and puts them in a position where they can make a difference. That's modern development. Now, they're not going to become, necessarily, accountants or lawyers quite yet, but they're going to get vocational training, and they're going to learn how to work in a hotel or work in a restaurant or have computer skills, and it's exciting to see how that does empower women. When we look at an educated woman, we know that an educated woman is going to have fewer children, and she's going to have children later in life. And when she does have children, she will better be able to raise them so they're not stunted, so they're healthy. And that, to me, is just fundamental in how we're going into this next stage of development and overcoming extreme poverty. Again, you've got NGOs helping women get educated so they can nourish their kids smartly. And they're up against a lot of misinformation. There are corporations that we own stock in that make advertisements where there's somebody who looks like a doctor, says, if you love your children, you will stop breastfeeding them and you'll use powdered milk formula. This has been going on for decades. I think the very first thing I got upset about politically was when I was a kid. Nestle's was doing that, They're still doing it. They're still doing it. They're telling women that have no education, stop breastfeeding. If you know the game, you know there's nothing more important to keep your kids healthy with resistance and with proper, able to fend off diseases and so on, than to breastfeed the full length. And these are kind of things that people need to learn. People need to learn the importance of washing your hands. If you don't wash your hands, if your kids don't wash your hands, your kids are going to have diarrhea. You can feed them all day long, but they're going to just poop it out, and they're not going to have any of those nutrients. And this is a tragic thing that is so commonplace until people learn soap and water. You see, soap and water. It's fundamental, it's easy, but that's what health posts do. In Guatemala, in Ethiopia, in Papua New Guinea, all over the place, in poor reaches of those countries, there are health posts. And there are organizations, many of them run by the United Nations, that make it possible for women who will never have any money to see a doctor or get educated to learn how to raise their kids healthy. Every time I see a United Nations vehicle, I'm so thankful. And I've seen United Nations vehicles over the years in my travels. I don't know why it is that Americans have a chip on their shoulder about the United Nations. What on earth could we be so upset about with the United Nations? They are the first responders globally for desperate poverty, for societies in crisis. You could focus on some excuse why you don't like the United Nations, but if they're not here, these women are completely without help. The United Nations is there, the World Food Program. And to stand there and watch these women come in, they come in every week for their lessons, to get their kids measured and checked, and to get their supplemental nutrition if they need it. It's exciting. It's constructive. It makes a difference. I saw it in Guatemala. I saw it in Ethiopia. And this is a challenge. There's people dedicating their lives to doing this, and there are people in the first world that care but have not figured out yet how that can be connected. And one thing I'm going to talk about later on, and I want to talk about it right now just in case I forget, but you kind of wonder, well, what can I do? You can support the NGO of your choice, which is a great thing to do, if you like the way they do development aid, whatever they might be into. Or you could remember that all the good works that NGOs do, put together and tripled, doesn't even measure up to how much impact American foreign policy decisions have on these kind of things. It really boils down to, does our government represent us in seeing the value of smart developmental aid? Again, even if you don't care about love your neighbor, I mean, that's a legitimate reason, but even if you just don't want people coming into our country, that's a fundamental thing that we need to do. Smart, effective development aid. This woman needs to know if she and her kids are getting enough nourishment, and if they're not, what's going on. So they get measured. The kids get measured. And if they're too skinny, they get some super peanut butter, and then they come back in 2 weeks and they measure them again. The United Nations itself has spearheaded a global program for inoculations. All of us who are parents, of course we got our kids inoculated. The worst parent gets their kids inoculated. In the developing world, a lot of people don't have access to that. Well, the United Nations has made it possible, and now measles, typhoid and pneumonia are just almost gone now. It used to be a big deal in the developing world, but they've been inoculated. It's a huge step. You see the moms taking their kids in, they're getting measured and everything, and you realize stunting is one of the scourges of the developing world. Stunting, it's a new understanding that the most important thing is to make sure your child gets good nutrition in the first 1,000 days. 9 months of pregnancy, and then 2 years after that. If that child doesn't get good nutrition, I'm not talking enough calories. They got to get the right calories. That child will be stunted. Guatemalan kids are stunted. Indigenous Guatemalan kids. White Guatemalan kids, meaning Spanish, are not stunted, generally, but more than half of the indigenous Guatemala kids are stunted. They're not short because of their ethnicity. They're short because of structural poverty. And when somebody is stunted, height-wise, they're stunted up here. They're the slowest kid in the class, and half of the kids have that, they will never, ever be able to produce like they were meant to. There'll be a drag on the society. There'll be a drag on the economy. There'll be a drag on stability. We can deal with stunting. We can deal with the first 1,000 days. This is another example of smart, modern development aid. So when you see a child that's adequately nourished going to school, you really feel like there's hope. I love the thought that societies are recognizing that kids need nutrition and they need education. And if you're wearing your hard capitalist hat, just think of it as human capital. You can't have good workers unless they're healthy and educated. Okay? So either way, we can get that together. Education is a challenge in the developing world. There's all sorts of pitfalls for good education. In Latin America, education is provided by the government, but it's only in Spanish. If you speak an indigenous language, you don't get education. Schools are provided, but they're 6 miles away from the poor town. And you can't get there. So the family can't afford the bus ride. Education is provided, but children have to have a uniform. And a uniform costs 3 weeks' wages. And you just can't handle that right now. The father wants the kid to work in the fields. The mom wants him to go to school. The father keeps him in the fields. There's a lot of reasons kids don't get an education. In Ethiopia, the government has really dictated that all the kids are going to get an 8th grade education. 8 grades, and then a few months of vocational training, and then they're into the workforce. That's a beautiful thing. That's enough. It's incremental. So you see the schools, and you see the hard work going on, and you see governments working with communities to make sure the young generation is educated, and it's pretty exciting. Here's an example of one of these low-hanging fruits in development. In much of the world, the cultural tradition is women who are having their period really can't be in public. Now, if you're a schoolgirl having her period, 4 days a month, you can't go to school. You miss a week of school every month. How can you keep up? How can you be successful that way? Well, in a modern school in Ethiopia now, you have something called the Girls' Club with counselors, with all the help and whatever they might need, so they can, without embarrassment and without being immodest or whatever, they can be having their period and they can also go to their classes. Suddenly, girls don't have that disadvantage. And suddenly, the boys get a good education, and so do the girls. That's a triumph right there. What does it take? A little bit of smart development, a little bit of help with an NGO, a little bit of cooperation with the government. The people certainly don't drag their feet when it comes to this kind of help. So we've had this wonderful trajectory of fighting extreme poverty. As I mentioned, it's gone down. We've cut it in half in the last generation. I'm talking extreme poverty, these $2 a day people, going from 2 billion to 700 million. And we were on a great track until 4 or 5 years ago when it started to tick up again. And it's ticking up again because of what I call the 3 C's: conflict, corruption, and climate change. And climate change is huge. Even since I've been working on this, climate change has become more of an issue. Conflict's another issue. In the future, they say the hungry people will generally be in failed nations that are embroiled in conflict, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. When you have conflict, you just can't have an economy, and it is the civilians that get hurt more during this kind of conflict than the soldiers. Well, the corruption and the conflict and the structural poverty goes way, way back. We were in Antigua. Antigua is the colonial capital of Central America. It's the most touristy town in Guatemala, and it was founded in 1543 by the Spaniards. And it really is just designed to harvest Central America of all of its resources and send it back to Spain. And ever since then, you've had this dynamic of conquistadors coming in, whether from Spain or the United States or local elites or whatever, and huge amount of poor people and most of the resources leaving the country. you've got this very aggressive kind of economic reality where big companies buy the good land and they force the landless people to the bad land. There's something called cash cropping, which is really part of structural poverty. Cash cropping, remember, we all believe, I think, in the free market and capitalism and this kind of stuff. Unbridled capitalism means if my cat has more buying power than your child, my cat gets the tuna and your child goes hungry. And that's kind of the dynamic that's going on between wealthy elites and struggling poor parents. And with cash cropping, you've got a situation where the elites end up owning all the arable land. And if you're a big shot in Guatemala and you own all this land, you're not going to grow rice and beans to feed local people. That's just stupid. You're not owning all this land to feed local peasants. You're owning all this land to get really rich. There are billionaires in Guatemala. What you do with your land is you grow food for export, right? So land that used to help peasants subsist by growing rice and beans, now you've booted the peasants off of that land and you're growing fancy flowers for export, you're growing coffee for export, you're growing beef for export, and so on. And the peasants don't have any land to grow their rice and beans. It gets to the point where there's almost no food grown for local consumption, and the landless peasants can only get a job by working on the plantation, and they take their plantation wages and they buy tin food from the United States to feed their kids. It's that vicious cycle. That's an example of structural poverty. Land issues. You know, we all grew up with all these wars in Central America, and it's even framed today. Communists and socialists against freedom lovers and capitalists, you know. It's not communism against capitalism. It's land rights. It's all about land rights. I just was visiting with an organization in Guatemala that works on helping landless peasants get land. 5 of their colleagues have been murdered in the last year. It's dangerous stuff when you organize peasants so they can own land, because big corporations, sugar, coffee, palm oil, they need that land. And if you own a little farm and the sugar plantation wants it, you'll get a visit. And they'll say, would you like to sell your land to us? We can negotiate with you, or we can negotiate with your widow. What's it going to be? And the consequence is the sugar plantation owns all the good land, and the local people are shoved further and further up the slope of the mountain with rockier and rockier soil. That's structural poverty. And that's what's going on in a country like Guatemala. It's sort of the standard operating procedure. I was in these villages way up in the high country. I mean, this is 8,000, 9,000 feet in altitude, rocky soil. And way on the left, there's a little shack. That used to be the community center. And then I saw this beautiful new cinder block community center, and they were so proud of it and excited about it. It was a $3,500 investment on the community and volunteer labor to build that thing. And that was a gift from some NGO to get that community center. But I thought, what a beautiful investment of $3,500 to give a community like that a place to meet. When the dentist is in town, he's got a place to set up shop. When the women want to get together and raise their voices for more respect on this or that issue, they've got a place where they can meet. Do the elites like it for local people to have a place to meet? Not really. Reminds me of town hall. This is a great place in that same kind of vein. It's an affordable place where we can come together and share ideas. To see the value of that, considering the challenge they have to own land, it's development. Most of the wars in Central America have been over land rights. In Guatemala, 200,000 people died in their 30-year-long civil war. And we walked in the cemeteries where people still remembered their fathers who were killed in that war. Why were they killed? They wanted to own land so they could grow rice and beans for their kids, rather than being kicked off the land so that land could grow food for export. So there's this kind of structural poverty that people are struggling with, and that with all the desperation and the lack of a middle class, there's a lot of guys out there just breaking into places, and there's a need for armed guards. It's a booming business. When you don't have a middle class, you've got a need for armed guards. And when you go to a country like Guatemala, you'll see an armed guard in front of every pharmacy, every hotel, and every bank. And I've kind of thought that you learn about your own country sometimes by leaving it. I learn a lot about the United States by leaving it and looking at it from afar and going to a country that has our problems that have been extrapolated into a more extreme situation. But I would think we're going to have more armed guards in our society in the next decade, in front of banks, in front of different... In Guatemala, if you live in a middle-class neighborhood, you've got to pool your money to have an armed guard so your kids can go safely to the park. It's because there's no hope for people and there's a lot of desperation. I asked this guy, Fito, who's in the barrio by the garbage dump in Guatemala City, former gang member, former professional recycler. He works now with an organization that helps kids not go into gangs. I asked him about all of the homicides, the murders in the country. And he said, well, if you live in this town and you need money because your daughter is sick and you got to get medicine, you need $40. You don't have $40. Your daughter's going to die or have a terrible problem. You need to get that medicine. Well, the neighbor has a gun. You can rent the gun from the neighbor with bullets, and you go downtown with that gun, and you find a wealthy person in the city, and you stick them up and you get $40 so you can get your daughter some medicine. You don't want to shoot anybody, but with this gun you're likely to get money so you can get your daughter her medicine. And you usually do. You stick somebody up. My son lives in Medellin in Colombia, and when he's talking to me on his cell phone, he says, I got to put my cell phone away now. He's going into a more dangerous neighborhood. I've got a friend in a little barrio in Managua, and every time her daughters get on a bus, they have to decide, are we going to bring our cell phone and our jewelry with us? Because there's a good chance the bus is going to be stopped and it's going to be robbed, It's just, that's what they have to do to get their medicine. And sometimes somebody's on them and they shoot and they run and somebody gets killed. But it's desperation. And they get home and they've got their money, they give the gun back, and then they buy the medicine. But I was thankful that Fito told me that story because it gave me a little empathy for a thug with a gun that might be a father with a sick child living in a world where there's no fairness and he needs to get some medicine. I asked Fito about what is the allure of gangs? Why is gangs such a big deal in Central America? And he told me that because the reality of kids that live in the barrio, there's no hope, their parents are separated, the father has got all this trouble, there's no love, there's no dignity, there's no respect, there's no work. He said, if we join a gang, we've got family, we've got power, we've got a job, we've got money, I got a gun, people are afraid of me, and they've got a certain kind of love in that gang world. It's an alternative. But there's got to be a way to deal with that, but nobody's really dealing with it effectively now. And that's a very serious setback, is the gang violence in Central America. So we had a very interesting time visiting with him and learning about that reality, including it in our show. When we go to Africa, we've got the same struggles with conflict. As I said, in the future, they figure most hungry people are going to be in broken societies that are having conflict, and we've got corruption. The African Union is really serious about dealing with corruption. The major setback is climate change. And climate change hits the poorest countries. It hits the poorest people in the poorest countries hardest. That's the powerful thing about climate change. In Guatemala, every year they had a hunger season that started when the harvest ran out before the next harvest. Usually what was in May, you have the hunger season. Now the hunger season starts in March. The hunger season is getting wider every year because climate change, unpredictable, less yield. The water comes, but it comes in torrential downpours. You see it. You see it here, you see it in Europe now, and you certainly see it in the developing world. When rain comes all at once, it washes the topsoil away. When people deforest their land in order to have firewood, more topsoil washes away. It's all tied together. It's a vicious cycle. I saw a man with an app in Guatemala that actually showed where the fires are every day. because there's so many fires breaking out during a drought. Abadi, in his community, has figured out how to deal with the violent rainfall, and now they've terraced the hillsides, they've made reservoirs, and when the rain comes down in torrents, it doesn't wash the topsoil away, but it replenishes the water table, and he's got access to it now, and he can irrigate his crops, whether there's a drought or not. So when we think about the impact of climate change, I think we got to remember that we contribute to climate change, and the developing world contributes to climate change just in their everyday activities. We like to do our lives in ways that contribute less to climate change and global warming. It would be nice if people in the developing world could do the same thing. Of course, they're pretty desperate with their economics and they can't afford a big expense, but there are ways for people in the developing world who are farming to contribute much less to global warming and still do their work. And this is a new science, a new sort of approach to agriculture called climate-smart agriculture. It's very exciting, and it's an honest way that we can really dent the contribution to climate change and slow it down by helping the developing world do their work while contributing less to it. As a tour organizer, this is a big part of our responsibility to be an ethical company. And we've got something called the Climate Smart Commitment, where we are giving ourselves a self-imposed carbon tax for every one of the people we take to Europe. Experts say if you smartly invest $30 per flight to Europe, you can mitigate the negative impact of your flight by helping in this way to minimize carbon put into the environment. It's not, I don't buy this flight shame stuff, I just like the notion of mitigation. If I'm going to do that, it creates a problem. I can do this, and it creates a bonus. That's as much as the problem, and it zeroes it out. So we're investing $1 million in 10 organizations that will let our 30,000 travelers go to Europe and back in a climate-neutral way, in a carbon-neutral way. And what we're doing, rather than buying carbon offsets, thank you. What we're doing, I didn't just want to do the conventional buy into carbon offsets. What I wanted to do was invest in climate-smart agriculture in the developing world. And it's something we're learning a lot about. It's something that's brand new. It's something that experts in this are really embracing. It's not pie in the sky. It's real. It makes a difference to help people get smart stoves or to help people plant trees or work on their water table and so on. And if you're wondering what are some good organizations to help on that, at the end of this month, we're going to award our $1 million to these 10 different organizations. It'll be on our website, and you can see which organizations we'll be giving that money to, and then what they're going to do with that money in the area of climate-smart agriculture, because that's an important issue going forward. I just think it makes sense. I wish our government imposed this tax on us and then made that happen so we could do our business ethically. But until that happens, ethical business should do it on their own, I think. So we're making this model. As far as globalization goes, remittances are a good example of how connected we all are. You know, when you go down to Guatemala, you see a lot of mansions. They're called remittance palaces. And the oldest son is in the United States working real hard, and they're sending money home. And they build a nice big house. The biggest house in the village has American flags on it. If you see American flags on a modern building in Guatemala, it's paid for by remittance money from the United States. When our government decides to send 200,000 people from El Salvador back to El Salvador because they're working illegally in our country, I forget what the number is, I forget how many people it is, but I understand about 20% of the economies of some of these countries in Central America is made by remittances. If suddenly all of these people can't do their work and send remittances down, that puts this country into a desperate strait, and those people are sent back there with no jobs and aren't really members of that society anymore, and you've got a double burden on that society. No more 20% of their economy sitting down by remittances, and all these frustrated people landing in a world where they don't really fit anymore. And then all of the lost opportunities from them doing their work here that they were employed by people who needed them. You see, it's a big, there's so many ripples to that. But remittances are an important issue, and it's a good example of how we're all tied together in so many ways. Now, when we think about Central America, we think about banana republics. That whole banana republic notion goes back to the days when these were the farms for the developed world. All we want is your bananas. You're just going to grow bananas and sell them to us cheap. And you're going to grow coffee and you're going to grow sugar, you know, or you're going to make sugar. There are trade policies that make it very difficult for banana republics to process their raw materials in that country. If you grow peanuts, you cannot make peanut butter. You have to export your peanuts raw. If you grow cocoa, you can't make chocolate bars, you got to export it, and the real money will be made in the developed world. If you grow coffee, the coffee growers that we met in Guatemala and Ethiopia were frustrated because they wanted to roast some of their beans and sell them roasted. But because of the tariffs and the trade arrangements, they could only viably export green beans, not roasted beans. So this is another example of structural poverty where the developed world has to deal with realities that keep them undeveloped and keep us making more money because we want them to be banana republics. We saw huge plants in Guatemala, you know, packaging up raw sugar and exporting it. And we talked to them and we found out how they would really rather process it. And they're finding ways now in globalization to process their sugar, and then it becomes more profitable to sell it. They're making a brand, they're processing it. The same thing with coffee, they're struggling to make more connections that way. We learned something called the value chain. I never sort of thought about this before, but there's a little farmer on the slope of that volcano that grows coffee beans. How does he get to our little coffee shop here? How does that coffee get from here to there? It's a whole bunch of links. He's got to be able to sell it to a processor here, who's got to be able to package it and monitor the quality, and then put it in a bag and put it on a truck that has a road that goes to the port, that has a ship waiting for it, that has a willing buyer in the United States. We saw guys from like Stumptown Coffee and so on, all different gourmet coffee roasters from the United States down in Guatemala, visiting with these guys, and it was just two ends of that value chain. The value chain is critical. Big companies are doing it. Little farmers are finding out how also. And that's the exciting thing. Little farmers need to be able to engage in globalization just like those big coffee and sugar plantations are doing. This is Pedro, and Pedro's got his land, and Pedro does not like snap peas, or sugar snap peas, whatever they're called. I do. In fact, I've got one right here. This was on my little green room munchie plate, and Pedro has a man who's the organizer to connect all of these different links together, and Pedro grows something he does not like to eat. Him and his kids have never really eaten one of these things. They just don't like them. It's not in their diet. But they were told by an NGO, if you want to make money with this land, you don't need to grow rice and beans. Grow sugar snap peas. He says he's like running through money in his field there. It's wonderful. We saw all the kids working. We saw all the trucks coming in. We saw the carefully harvested peas that were going to the United States and going to England. Globalization. Small farmer, NGO coaching him, don't be subsistence, diversify. Here's a lawyer, own your land, sugar snap peas. They're very profitable. They grow good on this soil. And that's how it works. It's exciting. Same thing with goat's milk. You can make all sorts of good stuff at the goat plant. These are all the villagers coming together with a startup, creating a brand, packaging, trying to sell it to us. They give us a whole sales pitch. They might not have their goat dairy going to the United States, but they'll have it going to the big city market, and that's development, and that's happening all over the place. Something you notice when you're in Africa is China. China is everywhere. In Africa, they told me, the United States invests for the next election. China invests for the next generation. Africa's infrastructure is designed to banana republic it out. It's just roads to the port, ship out your natural resources to the rich world so they can process it and make a lot of money. China is investing so Africa can now trade with itself, and so Africa can be new sources of labor and productivity right there. China is helping Africa build trains and roads and office parks, industrial plants. This is a big plant in South Ethiopia called Hawassa, built by the Chinese, and it's 60 industrial sheds rented by companies from the United States and Europe to come here and enjoy the cheap labor, employing tens of thousands of people, generating $1 billion in trade revenue for Ethiopia, this one plant built with the help of China. And each of these sheds has people that were in the countryside struggling on $2 a day, and they decided to get a bit of vocational training, and now they're earning $8 a day as the new sweatshop of the world. China used to be the sweatshop of the world, remember? But that's a stepping stone in development. You might think, oh, that's terrible. They got to work so hard in such terrible conditions. Well, you can say that because you're privileged. A struggling person in the barrio, in that ravine, that's all they want right now. $5 a day job, great. I'm there tomorrow morning. And that's what we got here. So Ethiopia, with 100 million people, is trying to be the next China when it comes to cheap labor. China has evolved out of it. Ethiopia is evolving into it. That's development. These guys want that job. These guys, with the help of the government, with the help of NGOs, with that initiative on their own part, got an education, and now they can work in that plant. Technology is enabling these societies to leapfrog a little bit, which is pretty exciting. And you can jump right into some wireless technology. Of course, off the grid, solar panels is an exciting opportunity. Abedi, the farmer, he's got a big plant where he puts all of his manure. Out the bottom comes fertilizer, and out the top comes biogas. The biogas is piped right into his house, and now he no longer uses a kerosene lantern. All of his lights are powered by biogas. His fire, his heat, his stove is biogas, made from this process with the fertilizer and the dung. That's easy technological advancement. Cell phones. Can you imagine? The poorest people seem to have cell phones. Everybody's got a cell phone. A cell phone gives you power. If you're a farmer, you can take a photograph of the fungus on your plant, and you can email it to somebody at headquarters and those government outfits, and they'll tell you what's going on. With a cell phone, you can sell your crop directly to the restaurant. With a cell phone, if you're a herder, you can know what the price is for goats in this market or that market. With a cell phone, you can do your mobile banking without having to make a trip from the village all the way to the city to the bank. The cell phone is really giving people a lot of power. Remember, a lot of these communities are off the grids. People have cell phones, but they don't have electricity. So small business people actually have a solar panel, and they charge your cell phone for a nickel. And you'll see all these cell phones being charged up at the person who's got that little business on the side. Something else fundamental for development is access to capital, to banking. We don't really think about that because we all grow up having access to banks. But if you go to Europe, you find these banks are really fancy places. They used to be really fancy, and not everybody could go into them. It was for the elites and the well set up. In the developing world, it's still that way. And a landless peasant just can't have the opportunity to bank. When you have opportunity to bank, you can then develop. We were walking down through the barrio in Addis Ababa, and we stumbled onto a commotion in a woman's courtyard. We went in, and this is Lisa's bank. This is just a lady who gathers all the women in the community together, and they've got their own community bank. And they've got a ledger. They've got a metal box with 2 keys, so you got to all get together to open it up. Every woman, every week, puts some money into the bank, and they can, if they're in a jam, they can be bailed out, they can borrow, they can pay interest. It's a community bank that empowers those women. In a related sense, there's a new phenomenon in the development world called microlending. You've probably heard of it. If an organization has $10,000, they can loan $500 to 20 people. And those people, in a couple of months, will pay it back, and you loan it to 20 more people. Every time you loan that money, somebody starts a business. She started a store, paid off her debt. Now she's a shopkeeper. This family grows a couple of extra cows. and that helps them supplement their family income. They paid off their debt right away. This woman is now this shoe shop in the village. It just took a couple $100 from a microloan, and she's up and running. This woman needed money to get a loom, and now she's got her own business going. And this lady is a beader. And this was a beautiful example. She's got her whole house is set up to do this beading, and they sell all this stuff wholesale to the big city. And she told me that it's interesting, women get these loans, and one of the first people they employ is their husband. This woman employs her husband and 20 other people making beads now. She's a tycoon because of a microloan. It's development. So, just to wrap up, with this whole project, thanks to public television, I'm hoping to just share with the United States the fact that it is realistic to tackle extreme poverty. I want to let people know what extreme poverty looks like. I want people to understand that we are privileged, we don't need to be guilty, but even if you don't care about love your neighbor, even if all you want to do is be secure, if you're smart, you will think more about building bridges and less about building walls, and you will help invest in the world. There'll be several applause lines coming up. You can wait till the very end. I was down in Guatemala on the day President Trump decided to, just because he was upset about something, line item out $500 million in aid. I was down there with aid workers, like anybody in this room, who decided not to work in finance or be a realtor or to be a computer programmer, but to go down there and invest their career in helping these people develop. And I saw the disheartened faces when they looked at each other and says, we can't do that program anymore because the United States cut this aid. And I saw the sadness in the people who were counting on that. There's real hope. There's real people. There's real struggles. There's real heroics. And what I want to let, the best I can as a travel writer, to let our country understand is we matter. The United States matters. My beat is Europe. Europe is sad that the United States is no longer in the lead. They want us. They need us to be in the lead. The United States is pulling out of this stuff. The rest of the world is pulling it together and doing what they can, but our country can help out. And we can do it not because we're Christians or not because we care about people. Because in the privacy of the voting booth, I think half of Americans just vote for what is good for them. This can be framed in what is good for me. And it also can be framed in love your neighbor. It's a beautiful thing. But that's real. The consequences of that are real. I'm a friend of David Beckman, who's the president of Bread for the World. If you know my business, you know we're big fans of Bread for the World. That's advocacy. That's explaining to our government why this really matters. And David and his staff are in there, in the halls of Congress, explaining to Congress, explaining to representatives that this really is such an opportunity to make our world more stable and more just. And the United States can do it. It's not without our reach. This is not pie in the sky. It just takes a little bit of understanding. It's a team. You've got NGOs, you've got capable, willing governments, you've got caring people in the wealthy world, you've got hard-working locals. Locals down there told me, we just want to work hard and export. They don't want to come up here. They don't like our food. They don't like our food. They want to stay there. Nobody comes to the United States out of anything less than desperation. This is an opportunity to help people stay at home. There's enough food. There's enough wealth. We can still be really, really, really well off, and we can invest in development south of the border. And when you go there, when you have the opportunity to go there yourself and talk to these people, you realize that it is really worthwhile. So people ask, what can I do? Well, you look at how much do you need, and realistically you take what you need, but then you're smart enough as a rich person to know that if I consume more, it's not going to make me that much happier. It's just kind of what you do when you have extra money. And then you can have a sense of, there's a way that you can enjoy vicarious consumption. You can take that worthless extra consumption in your world and put it where it's really desperately needed by somebody who's still steep on that curve, and you can enjoy vicariously what it does for them and their family. That's a way to make philanthropy almost fun and selfish. And it really works. Now, you have the joy as a person, whether you've got $100 or $1,000 or more, you've got the joy of picking what you want to do. Maybe you really are inspired by water. You could help drill it well. Maybe you're inspired by micro-lending. You could help somebody start a business. Maybe you love this idea of equipping a company to help a farmer have a loan to buy the land and a lawyer to make sure that they're going to have firm title to it so they'll never be kicked off that land. You can do any of that stuff. And it's really gratifying, and it makes a difference. But I do think you have to remember that all of that good stuff together amounts to diddly compared to American government policies. And that's why I'm really into advocacy. Advocacy is a nice word for lobbying. Lobbying has a bad image because people with selfish interest hire people to lobby for them so they get more than their share, at least of their voice heard in Congress. But lobbying can be done to do beautiful things too. And organizations do lobby for this. And I think our legislators, deep down inside, want to do the right thing, but they are pushed by the people who sit at their table. And if we don't help people sit at their table who are telling them how and why to do the right thing, the people who are telling them how to do the selfish, short-sighted thing are going to get their way. That's why I think if you really want to make a difference, you can have a balance, but take seriously the opportunity to support an advocacy group, because the United States can make a huge difference, and the United States is us. It's okay to lobby for development in the developing world. When you know these people, you know it's worthwhile. They want to live there, they want to work hard, and so do those kids. All right. So that's what I'm doing with my show, and I'm really thankful to be able to share that with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, what did I do? I talked too long. I'm sorry about that. If you have to go, I want to remind you, the bar downstairs is Auto Bar. It's open till 10:30. So if you want to go downstairs and have a drink and talk about this with people, that'd be a good opportunity. And again, if you want to leave, I understand I talked too long. But I do want to answer questions, and I'll limit it to 10 minutes. So if anybody wants to, there's a mic here and a mic there, we can do that. And if I answered all your questions, that would be fine too. I think I did. Okay. What do you think? Should we have questions? Or yeah, we got a question here. Yep.
Hello. I've heard a lot from friends who have been to Africa that there is the China presence is really huge, as you mentioned, and I'd just like to hear you speak a little more to really what is an incredible exercise of soft power by the Chinese in developing nations around the world.
Yeah, well, I don't know much more about it, but you're right. When you put it in terms of soft power, that's what China is doing. It's just common sense to invest in these countries. We did it when we had the dynamic of the Cold War. It was us and the Soviet Union trying to build dams and everything in Africa. Now, I think we're missing an opportunity. And China is seeing that opportunity. And China's going to own the infrastructure in much of the developing world. And China has a long, long view because they need food, they need labor, they want to be having a place to invest their excess resources. They know what they're doing. And it's very poignant when they told me, United States, we build things for the next election in fear and terrorism. And China is just, they're working hard. The people in Ethiopia said, for the same amount of money, the Chinese can build 5 miles of road where the Germans just build 1 mile of road. I mean, other contractors, they do a better job, but the Chinese just get it done fast and cheap. And that's what they're going for.
You're a fantastic man, and you're doing amazing work, and I'd like to ask a totally stupid question. If Tom Hanks is going to play Fred Rogers in his upcoming movie, as a PBS celebrity, who do you want to play you?
Well, that's a very nice question, and as long as I'm not in the same state of health as Fred Rogers, I will pay myself. Okay. Well, I just, this is such a community celebration to have Town Hall fixed up for the next century, and I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of that, and I know all of you are too. As Weir mentioned earlier, it's a team effort. People are members, people support this. I am so committed to this opportunity to get caring people together under one roof to let people who are passionate about something inspire us. And all of us have enjoyed that. I hope this has inspired you. Stay tuned for our TV show. I'm hoping to get it out in January, but you'll hear about it. I'll be giving talks like this around the community. On my website, we'll always be announcing that. And it's just been a delight to be with you all. Again, I'll be right here. If you want to get anything autographed, I'd be happy to do that. Happy travels. Thank you very much.